A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms just premiered on HBO, and since most fans think this is just a simple prequel about a wandering knight, they're missing the most crucial truth about this series. The show doesn't just connect to Game of Thrones, it literally explains why Jon Snow exists, how Daenerys becomes the last Targaryen, and what caused the Mad King's descent into madness. Every single major event in Game of Thrones can be traced back to the choices made by a humbled hedge knight and his bald squire in this seemingly smaller story. We're about to explore the hidden causation chains that prove A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms isn't a side story. It's the foundation that made Game of Thrones inevitable. Here's how a century-old tale of chivalry shaped the fate of Westeros. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms takes place exactly 89 years before Game of Thrones begins. But this isn't just random historical placement. Since the show is set in 209 AC, it captures the Targaryen dynasty at a crucial turning point that directly causes the events we know and love. The dragons have been dead for 50 years, so the Targaryens can no longer rely on fire and blood to maintain their rule. This forces them to engage with the common people in ways they never had to before, but it also makes them vulnerable to challenges that will echo through generations. The timing is perfect because it places us right after the first Blackfire Rebellion in 196 AC, which introduced a devastating concept to Westeros. Targaryens aren't untouchable. Daemon Blackfire proved that bastard Targaryens could challenge the throne, planting the seeds of doubt about Targaryen legitimacy that Robert Baratheon would later exploit. This rebellion happened because King Aegon IV legitimized all his bastards on his deathbed, creating multiple claimants to the Iron Throne. The political instability this caused directly leads to the weakened Targaryen position we see in Game of Thrones, where they've been reduced to exiled beggars across the narrow sea. Sir Duncan the Tall isn't just the main character. He's the direct ancestor of Brienne of Tarth, and this connection reveals something profound about how honor survives in Westeros. Since Duncan comes from Fleabottom, the poorest part of King's Landing, he understands the struggles of common people in ways that highborn knights never could. This perspective shapes his moral compass, creating a legacy of true chivalry that gets passed down through generations. George R.R. Martin himself confirmed this connection when designing the official Oathkeeper sword replica. When asked what should be featured on the sword's plaque, Martin chose Duncan's shield design, directly linking Brienne's weapon to her ancestor's legacy. This isn't coincidence, it's causation, because Duncan consistently chooses to protect the innocent over serving the powerful. He establishes a family tradition of moral courage that defines Brienne centuries later. The connection goes deeper than bloodline. Duncan's fighting style, his unwavering sense of justice, and even his awkwardness around nobility all echo in Brienne's character. When Brienne stands up to Jaime Lannister, defends the weak, and maintains her honor despite mockery, she's continuing a tradition that started with a hedge knight who had nothing but his integrity. This proves that the most important legacies in Westeros aren't about power or wealth. They're about the choices that define character across generations. The bald boy traveling as Duncan's squire carries the most explosive secret in the series. He's Prince Aegon Targaryen, future King Aegon V, and Daenerys Targaryen's grandfather. Seeing as Egg is the fourth son of King Daeron II, nobody expects him to inherit the throne, earning him the nickname Aegon the Unlikely. But this unlikely path to power becomes crucial to understanding how the Targaryen bloodline survived to produce both Jon Snow and Daenerys. Egg's time with Duncan fundamentally changes him because he experiences life as a commoner, learning about poverty, injustice, and the struggles of ordinary people. When he eventually becomes king, he attempts radical reforms to protect the small folk and limit the power of abusive lords. These reforms make him enemies among the nobility, but they also establish him as one of the most beloved kings in Westeros history among the common people. The tragedy is that Egg's idealism, shaped by his travels with Duncan, ultimately leads to his downfall. Since the great houses resist his reforms and his own children defy his attempts to arrange marriages that would strengthen the realm, Aegon V becomes increasingly desperate to restore Targaryen power. This desperation drives him to attempt hatching dragon eggs at Summerhall, the catastrophic fire that kills both him and Duncan the Tall. But this same fire also leads to the birth of Rhaegar Targaryen, making it the pivotal moment that connects a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms directly to Game of Thrones. The fire at Summerhall in 259 AC is the single most important event linking these two series, because it simultaneously ends the Duncan and Egg story while beginning the chain of events that leads to Game of Thrones. King Aegon V, desperate to restore his family's power and frustrated by political opposition, attempts to hatch dragon eggs using wildfire and ancient rituals. The experiment goes catastrophically wrong, killing the king and destroying the castle. Duncan the Tall dies at Summerhall, but his final act shapes the future of Westeros. Instead of protecting the king as ordered, Duncan chooses to save lives, most crucially, Princess Rhaella Targaryen. Because Duncan saves Rhaella, she survives to give birth to Rhaegar Targaryen, almost immediately after escaping the flames. Without Duncan's sacrifice, there would be no Rhaegar, no Jon Snow, and no hope for the prophecy of the prince that was promised. The Summerhall tragedy also creates Aerys II, the Mad King, who was born in the shadow of this disaster. As Aerys grows up, obsessed with fire, dragons, and the restoration of Targaryen power, he becomes increasingly paranoid and unstable. This madness directly causes Robert's rebellion when Aerys demands the heads of Robert Baratheon and Ned Stark. The same event that ends a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms sets up the political crisis that begins Game of Thrones. If you're starting to see how these connections run deeper than anyone realized, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're just getting started with these revelations, and you won't want to miss how the political foundations laid in a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms directly enable every major conflict in Game of Thrones. One of the most touching connections between the series involves Maester Aemon, the wise old man who guides Jon Snow at the Night's Watch. Since Aemon is Egg's older brother, his decision to give up his claim to the Iron Throne directly enables Aegon the Unlikely to become king. This sacrifice ripples through history because it puts the right Targaryen on the throne at a crucial moment. Aemon's choice to become a maester instead of a king demonstrates the same moral clarity that defines Duncan the Tall. Since Aemon recognizes that his younger brother would be a better ruler, he voluntarily removes himself from succession. This decision proves that the Targaryens of this era still possess the wisdom and selflessness that their descendants lose. When Aemon later counsels Jon Snow about duty, honor, and sacrifice, he's passing down lessons learned from watching his brother rule with integrity. The connection becomes even more poignant when you realize that Aemon is Jon Snow's great-great-uncle. Considering Aemon gave up the throne so Egg could rule, and Egg's line eventually produces Rhaegar, Aemon's sacrifice directly leads to Jon's existence. This means that when Aemon tells Jon, "Love is the death of duty," he's speaking from the experience of a man who chose duty over personal desire and watched his family pay the price for generations. The political foundations of Robert's rebellion trace directly back to a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms because of a marriage alliance that seems minor but proves crucial. Egg's sister marries into House Baratheon, creating the Targaryen bloodline that Robert Baratheon later uses to justify his claim to the Iron Throne. This isn't just a legal technicality, it's the causation chain that makes Robert's conquest politically legitimate. Given that the Targaryens of Egg's era are trying to stabilize their rule after the Blackfyre rebellions, they arrange strategic marriages with powerful houses. Egg's sister's marriage to a Baratheon lord creates a blood connection that lies dormant for generations. When Robert needs to justify overthrowing the Mad King, he can point to this Targaryen ancestry as proof that he's not just a usurper, but a legitimate claimant restoring proper rule. This connection explains why Robert's rebellion succeeds where other challenges to Targaryen rule failed. Since Robert has both the military strength to win and the legal justification to rule, he can unite the great houses behind his cause. The marriage alliance arranged during Egg's reign provides the political cover that transforms a rebellion into a restoration, making it the foundation upon which the entire Game of Thrones story is built. The mysterious three-eyed raven who guides Bran Stark has his origins in a knight of the Seven Kingdoms as Brynden Rivers, also known as Bloodraven. Because Brynden is instrumental in bringing the first Blackfyre rebellion by killing Daemon Blackfyre with arrows, he becomes one of the most powerful figures in Westeros. His use of magic and spies to maintain Targaryen rule makes him both feared and effective. But it also sets him on the path toward his supernatural transformation. Brynden's actions during his era directly shape the political landscape that leads to Game of Thrones. As he ruthlessly suppresses threats to Targaryen rule, he helps maintain stability during Egg's reign. But his methods also create enemies and resentment that contribute to the dynasty's eventual downfall. When Brynden later becomes the Three-Eyed Raven, he's trying to correct the mistakes and oversights of his human life by guiding future generations toward better choices. The connection reveals that Bran's story isn't separate from the main political narrative. It's the culmination of a magical bloodline that's been shaping Westeros history for over a century. Since Brynden Rivers learned to see the bigger picture through his network of spies and informants, he develops the perspective necessary to become the mystical guardian of human memory and knowledge. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms proves that the most important stories in Westeros aren't always about kings and dragons. Sometimes they're about the choices made by good people in impossible situations. Because Duncan the Tall chooses honor over advancement, he creates a legacy that survives in Brienne of Tarth. Since Egg learns compassion from living among the common people, he becomes a king who tries to reform an unjust system. As their story ends in tragedy at Summerhall, it begins the chain of events that leads to Jon Snow, Daenerys Targaryen, and the final battle against the Night King. Every major character in Game of Thrones exists because of choices made in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. Jon Snow's noble nature comes from a bloodline shaped by Egg's compassion and Aemon's wisdom. Daenerys' desire to break chains echoes her grandfather's attempts at reform. Even the Mad King's obsession with fire traces back to the trauma of Summerhall. This isn't just a prequel. It's the origin story that explains why Game of Thrones happened the way it did. The series reminds us that in Westeros, as in life, the smallest choices can have the biggest consequences. A hedge knight's decision to protect the innocent, a prince's choice to live among commoners, a maester's sacrifice for his brother. These moments of decency create ripples that shape the fate of nations. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms shows us how individual integrity can survive and influence history across generations. It proves that even in the darkest times, honor and compassion matter more than power and politics. That's how A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms connects to Game of Thrones, not just through bloodlines and politics, but through the enduring power of good people making difficult choices. What connections surprised you the most? Do you think Duncan and Egg's influence make the ending of Game of Thrones more meaningful? Or does it make the Targaryen downfall more tragic? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video if these connections blew your mind as much as they did mine. Subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden connections that make Westeros the most intricate fantasy world ever created.